Good morning. Today we're in week 4 of the room where it happens, and you're in the room where it happens. I mean, today, literally all around the world, people are coming together in rooms an awful lot like this, and we're all doing the same thing. We are worshiping. So far in our series, we have been to rooms where God is at work, and we've been to a room where there was listening, and we've been to a room where there was forgiving. We've been to a room where there was loving. And so today we are headed to a room where there was worshiping. Now, worshiping is a very churchy word. You don't really use the word worship outside of church or when you're thinking about religious things. But worship doesn't just happen in churches. Really, everyone worships. They may not think about it that way, but they do. They worship. You may know the name David Foster Wallace. He was a college professor. He was a writer who was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And many critics consider David Wallace, really his novel, Infinite Jest, they consider it the greatest postmodern novel. Here's why. His writing was real and raw, and it honestly detailed his struggles in life and his search for meaning and truth. Here's what he said when he spoke at Kenyon College's graduation. He said, and imagine him talking to a bunch of recent graduates. He said, here's something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you'll always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. Now he keeps going. He said, worship power, and you'll end up feeling weak and afraid. And you'll need even more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Then he says, worship your own intellect. Being seen as smart, you'll end up feeling stupid. Always on the verge of being found out. David Foster Wallace, he lived his hard and short life searching and looking for that right thing to worship. He was right. Everybody worships. You can actually come to a worship service and not worship the God we are here to worship. The God who promises that he's with us. The God who loves us. And the God who sent Jesus for you. If you're here today and you're what you might call a seeker, you aren't a follower of Jesus yet. You're exploring, and you're here today, or you're watching online. I am so glad you're here. Keep asking your questions. Keep up the search, because this is a safe place to explore. And of course, my prayer is that one day you will worship the one who is worth your worship. But if you are a follower of Jesus, you shouldn't just come to worship. You should worship. Every Sunday we do that together. We are believers and we gather and we do that. But if you're a follower of Jesus, you shouldn't just do that on Sundays. You should worship every day. We do it every week in this room, but you were made to worship. Worship should really be the liturgy of your life. Today we're headed to a room where a woman shows us what worship really is. Let's go to Bethany, to the room where it happens. While Jesus was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her sharply. "Leave her alone," Jesus said. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Can you imagine being there? We don't even get her name. But it's easy to imagine a very surprised Jesus and a very surprised host, Simon the leper. It's easy to picture the disciples upset by the whole thing. I mean, this woman came into the room and she knew exactly what she wanted to do. It was her best. Jesus says when everyone questions her, he says, she did what she could. She literally used all she had to come to Jesus. In Greek, that literally translates, she did what she had. So you could translate it, she gave all that she had. She didn't come to Jesus half-hearted. She was all in. She gave her very best. And that's really a simple and a wonderful definition of worship. We bring our best to God because he's worthy. We bring our best to God because he deserves it. Oswald Chambers said it this way. He said, worship is giving God the best that he has given you. Be careful what you do with the best you have. Worship is giving God the best. And I love that warning. Be careful what you do with your best. So many people can waste the best on other things. But this woman, she did what she could. It was her best. It was also extravagant. The woman could have anointed Jesus that day with just simple oil or nard. But notice what it says. This was pure nard. There's oil and then there's nard and then there's pure nard. It was expensive. It was the best. And she took that alabaster jar and she broke it. She didn't screw the top off so she could later save part of it. She literally broke the jar and she poured out every drop of the perfume. Now, everyone who saw that day, this wonderful act, would have known that it's Jewish tradition to anoint kings and prophets and priests. Jesus Christ, Christ means anointed one. So this act was suited. It should have been extravagant. But the disciples missed that. They thought it was a waste. Why wouldn't you sell it? Why wouldn't you give the money it was worth to the poor? Couldn't it have been used for something more practical? But Jesus was so quick on that. He said, you'll always have the poor. You'll always have the poor, but you won't always have me. It was extravagant. And it was sacrificial. It could have been used for the poor, but it also could have been used by the woman herself for something she wanted. Nard was an aromatic oil extracted from a root that came from India. So this was rare and this was expensive. We learned that it was worth more than an entire year's wages. It would have been very unusual for a woman in those times to have something that was so valuable. So where did she get it? Was it a family heirloom? If it was, it would have been so sacrificial to give it. Was it her dowry? If it was, it would have been such a sacrifice to give what would have been her security. Well, we don't know. But what we know is this would have been a once-in-a-lifetime gift. She would never have anything like this again. And she took all she had and she poured it out. It also didn't seem appropriate. This year has been, it's been really nice to be back to a normal football season, hasn't it? But if we look back just a year ago, NFL teams were trying their best to keep things going. They were trying to keep playing. And there were some crazy stories that came out of last season. And one of those stories was Kendall Hinton. Now, you may not know that name, but I do, because he, at one time, was a Wake Forest quarterback. And at Wake Forest, he had a lot of talent, but he always struggled until he changed positions. The coaching staff transitioned him from quarterback to wide receiver. Now, when he graduated, he wasn't drafted, but he found his way to the practice squad of the Denver Broncos. Here is Kendall Hinton. Now, a wide receiver on a practice squad does not start as a quarterback. But that's exactly what happened. See, after the entire quarterback room, starting with the starter, Drew Lock, and his two backups, they were all exposed to COVID, and Hinton got the call. It did not go well. They lost 31-3. He threw 2 interceptions. He was not in the right place. No one thought he was going to do well. It wasn't really appropriate, but there he was. And in spite of his negative QBR, which Hinton himself laughs about, everyone will always know his story, and here's why. His wristband, the one he wore that fateful day, the one he played terribly with, is in the NFL Hall of Fame. Here it is. People will always know the story of Kendall Hinton. Mary. Mary should never have been in that room that night. She was in the room with a bunch of reclining men. She never should have shown up unannounced. She should never have gotten that close enough to anoint Jesus. It wasn't appropriate. In fact, it was really uncomfortable for everyone. The disciples see this woman in a place where she doesn't belong, and she does something that is totally uninhibited. Something so outrageous and inappropriate. It may have been out of control. It may have been out of place, but she did way better than the NFL Hall of Fame. Jesus said, she would always be remembered whenever the gospel is preached. That woman and her inappropriate, extraordinary act of worship will always be remembered. And finally, that act of worship, it showed her heart. If we were to have coffee later this week, and I was to ask you, what was the best gift you ever received? I wonder what you'd say. Well, I suspect that it was the best gift, not because of the gift, but because of the giver. I was thinking about some of my best gifts I've ever been given. I thought back to a long time ago when John was 8 years old. The kids always celebrated Mother's Day. Mark was so good to make sure they did that, and they wanted to do that. But this year was different. 8-year-old John presented me a smile from ear to ear with flowers. He had worked to get those flowers. It was his money. And Mark didn't pick out the flowers. Anna didn't pick out the flowers. John picked out those flowers. You know, it wasn't just the gift that John brought me. It was his heart. It was his love. I mean, I could see it in his 8-year-old eyes. That gift came from the heart. Mary's gift. It showed this incredibly deep love for Jesus. As she took that alabaster jar and she broke it and poured that perfume on Jesus' head. You can see her heart. There's a little detail at the beginning of this event that you might have missed. This all happened in the home of Simon the leper. Simon the leper. Now, he couldn't have been a leper anymore. If he had been, he would have been banished from his community, and he wouldn't have been able to be in that house in Bethany. He would have been forced to live away from everyone. So since he was living in his own home in Bethany, he had to have been healed. And we can assume that Jesus was the one, that Jesus healed him. And that Simon had invited Jesus over to dinner probably to thank him for what he had done for him. Now, we don't know why this woman showed up. We don't know why she did what she did. Maybe she was healed too, and she was doing it because she was grateful. Maybe she recognized Jesus. She knew what was coming, and she knew who Jesus was. We don't really know. But she acted out of the fullness of her heart. It showed her heart. That night, that woman was teaching Simon and the disciples and everyone who would ever hear this story how to give Jesus the best. She's teaching us how to worship. This was the last meal that Jesus would have before the Lord's Supper that we're about to take. And at that meal, Jesus will tell the disciples again that he's about to give his life, his body and his blood, and then he'll be arrested, and then he'll walk towards the cross. So this woman pouring out the perfume over Jesus literally happens hours before that meal happens. She breaks the jar of expensive nard. She anoints Jesus' head. And Jesus tells the disciples, who won't have anything to do with this plan, they don't want to understand it, they don't agree with this plan, Jesus says, this act is preparing me for my burial. I mean, don't miss this. She poured out the perfume for Jesus. But Jesus was getting ready to pour out his blood for her. What would it look like for you to worship like this woman? See, you already know what's going to happen next. You know that Jesus is going to give his life. And you have to respond to that. See, Jesus gave his life for you, and worship is giving your life to Jesus. She gave all that she could, all that she has. What would it look like for you to bring your alabaster jar, your alabaster heart to him? You are worth everything to Jesus. And he was about to show it to this woman. And he's about to do for you what you couldn't do. You are worth everything to him. Is he worth everything to you? See, when Jesus takes your heart, you do extraordinary things. You understand who Jesus is and what he's done for you. You understand yourself and your need for him. So you act extravagantly. You worship. What would it look like for your worship to be sacrificial and extravagant? Maybe even inappropriate. Can you imagine bringing your alabaster jar and giving it to Jesus? I mean, bringing your most treasured things to him. Your children, your dreams, your money, your time, your future. Bringing all those things as an act of worship, telling Jesus that you want him. You want him to have it all. He's first place. He is Lord over all those other things. Friends, that is worship. That's bringing your alabaster heart to Jesus. As we get ready to take communion, I want you to spend a few minutes just getting ready. Just getting ready. Will you bring your heart? Will you bring your worship to Jesus?